Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Laura Miller. I'm the project manager here at the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions. And we're so thrilled that you could be with us today for our conversation on social audits, shortcomings, and alternatives. A reminder, this is part one of a two-part discussion. We're looking forward to sharing the details on the next session soon, but we're so glad you could be with us for the first part to kick us off today. So before we begin, I'm just going to go through a couple of quick reminders here to get us all ended and situated, and then we'll get moving. Quick note, we are recording today's session so that folks not able to be on the today can view the recording afterwards. And during the plenary discussion, we'll do a quick temp check to see whether folks feel comfortable continuing to record or if we might flip the cameras off and allow us to get into a bit more of a candid discussion. But for now, we are recording. If you need anything, you'll find the Zoom control panel just there along the bottom of your screen. And you're all automatically muted and your videos are off as you join, but you can access those controls there. During the discussion, we'll run through instructions for engaging there, but that's the bottom there. Find everything you need if you need to raise your hand. The chat box is also at the bottom. We encourage you to engage with us there throughout our presentations and through the discussion period later on. I do need to run through our antitrust policy. So please note, it is the policy of the Alliance to comply strictly with the letter and spirit of all domestic and applicable international antitrust and competition laws. Relevant here, these laws uniformly outlaw agreements among industry participants to refrain from any aspect of commercial competition. Generally speaking, these laws prohibit any formal or informal understanding among industry members regarding prices, policies, terms and conditions of sale, supplier policies, distribution policies, production plans or volumes, or any future business plans. Accordingly, participants in this Alliance meeting should not discuss these topics. If any participant engages in or becomes aware of any transgression of the Alliance antitrust policy, we ask that you please bring the matter to the immediate attention of Alliance Executive Director Mariah Boyle on the line today. One other quick note, we like for folks that our Alliance annual meeting is coming up in a few weeks here, November 15th to 18th. It's a conference format. It's open to anyone working in responsible seafood. I will add the agenda and registration links in the chat for anyone who isn't able to full hour, but if you can, please do stay. And in the last couple of minutes of the call, we'll share a couple more tidbits of information about the meeting. But here comes the link here to learn more about the meeting. And that's in the chat there for you, all the details you can find there. Okay, so from here, I'm going to turn it over to Mariah, Alliance Executive Director, to frame things up for our time together today. Mariah?
Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to tee up that this is the first conversation in a series where we want to listen to experts about the best approaches to improving labor conditions and be open to recognizing that our approaches for environmental improvements will not always be the correct path for social improvements. We know that this is a delicate topic. It's central to how many of the folks on the call work. At the same time, we must be open to changing our approaches in order to best help those working in the seafood industry. I know that's a goal we're all working towards. So I'd like to invite all of us to approach the conversation today with curiosity and with an open mind. And we'll have an opportunity to have a dialogue at the end of the call to exchange some ideas, to ask questions, to really listen to each other. So really looking forward to that. I'm excited that you're all on the line. And with that, I'd like to invite Laura to introduce the speakers and we'll get started.
Thanks, Mariah. So it is truly an honor, a pleasure today to be able to introduce to you Chara de Lacey and Lisa Rende Taylor. So Chara de Lacey joined Business and Human Rights Resource Center in July 2020, where she leads a project researching legal strategies for social audit accountability as part of the organization's corporate legal accountability program. Chara has worked in the human rights sector for 10 years, including prior experience at for International Development, where she ran business and human rights projects, and the International Bar Association, where she delivered justice sector reform programs. Chara is a UK qualified lawyer and holds an LLM degree in law, globalization, and development. And we've also got with us today Lisa Rende Taylor. Lisa founded the Issara Institute in 2014, and as the executive director, she oversees all strategy, programming, and innovation for the Institute. She has worked in the field of anti-human trafficking and forced labor for 20 years, beginning as a field researcher on the Thai-Burma border, then going on to work in the US State Department as regional director for the Asia Foundation in the ILO and as chief technical advisor for UNIAP. She is a recognized authority on forced labor and human trafficking, regularly appearing in global televised print and internet media. Her doctorate from the University of Washington in 2003 is in human behavioral ecology with a specialization in predictive analytics and trafficking risk. So, wow, two heavy hitters. We're super thrilled to have both of them on the line with us here today. And I'm going to invite Chara to kick us off. Thanks, Chara.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'll just share my screen. But what I'll do, I work out the technical side. I'll just say thanks very much, Laura. Yeah, thanks for the kind invitation, and obviously to the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions and everyone attending. I know you're part of the movement, for the invitation to join this discussion. I'm really delighted to be here. So as Laura says, my name's Chara, and I work at Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and I'm based in the London office. So greetings from London, actually quite a sunny London today. There we are, a technical glitch. So I'm going to focus my brief presentation really on the shortcomings of social audits based on our own research and wider reporting, and really frame this assessment against the rights holder focused approach that is set out in the standard of corporate conduct that you'll be very aware with under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and look at why social auditing falls short. So if I may take just a minute to introduce the Resource Centre for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with our work. We were founded in 2002 to provide a free global hub on business and human rights resources, and really to improve corporate transparency and accountability by reaching out to companies to request a response to allegations of corporate abuse through our company response mechanism. We also track attacks on human rights defenders, on those who raise the alarm about irresponsible business practices. And very worryingly, since 2015, we've recorded well over 3,000 attacks against defenders. And we also, and this is where, just moving for the sun, this is where our work on social audit accountability sits, monitor efforts to strengthen frameworks for corporate due diligence and legal accountability, and support action against companies who are implicated in human rights violations. Now, before I start, I wonder, I have a question. I realise that this is quite early in the morning, first thing for many of you at this webinar, but I wonder if I could ask you to type into the chat function. Laura, folks have access to that, but if you could type into the chat function, if you feel comfortable, the words that come to mind when you reflect on social audits or social auditing as a process. What do you think about when we sort of say we're talking about social auditing today? Maybe one or two words that come to mind. Spot check, site visit, yes. In-person interviews, thank you. Challenging. Lots of paperwork, not a lot of impact. Interesting. Insufficient, inconsistent. Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. So lots on kind of the process itself for social audits, which we'll touch on, COVID-19 and the impact, and also whether they are impactful as a process, which is our focus today. So thank you very much. Verifiable. Now the clipboard, health and safety issues, what benchmark, the criteria itself, the framework, unreliable, unenforced. lots of really great words here in terms of sort of going through some of the challenges and concerns of the social audit process that really ground our discussion on the what next. Move around, apologies for this. So the Resource Centre has been following companies' use of and reliance on actually social audits as a supply chain monitoring tool really for some years now. And this slide here shows our slide for our Beyond Social Auditing portal, which we launched in 2019, really to pull together those different perspectives, voices and reports, as well as case study examples of audit failings on social audits, as well as proposals for alternative methodologies. So it seems that many of you are really quite aware of some of the limitations, but as an early example of evidence-based research, some of you may have seen this, but it's research done in apparel textile supply chains. A 2005 report by the organisation Clean Coast Campaign really detailed the extent of labour exploitation at audited factories in the apparel sector, and even a fatal fire back in 2000 just beforehand in as well an audited and certified factory. And sadly, of course, there have been many more fatal fires in audited and certified work sites since. The report also really details some of the well-known concerns with audit processes, such as workers being coached and what data and responses to provide to auditors, double bookkeeping, audit perception, and lack of auditor expertise. In 2016, we carried out our own research into global buyers' reliance on social audits in contexts where really vulnerable workers were known to work. And in this case, this is where refugees were working in Turkey, refugees from Syria, were working in textile factories in Turkey. And through our engagement with companies, we found first that companies were predominantly relying on social audits, and that second, that these companies weren't aware of, and really that those audits are failing to report on the presence of Syrian refugees in these factories, despite their known presence, and therefore abuses against these workers were really being missed, as well as abuses against other hidden and irregular workforces. There we are. So I want to start by acknowledging my quite limited experience of the seafood sector and really appreciate its breadth across sort of environmental, human rights and biodiversity issues. But just for the focus here on labour conditions. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the nature of labour rights violations in high-risk sectors, such as the fishing industry. But just to contextualise the failings of the social audit model in the fishing sector, given the prevalence and nature of abuses, I'll give a very quick overview of some of our findings from engaging with canned tuna companies. And I preach this is a very small sector within a much bigger industry. But a couple of years back, we engaged 35 canned tuna brands and supermarkets, collectively 80 of the largest global canned tuna companies, really to get a sense of what they were doing, what were their approaches to monitoring labour conditions in their global supply chains. We reapproached those companies in 2021 to assess any changes, particularly given the impact of the pandemic on workers. And this time we also interviewed fishers, and we heard accounts of fishers being denied legal entry to ports, meaning they had forced to stay on board in unsanitary conditions, and otherwise heard accounts of really inhumane working conditions. In our latest engagement with these companies, so 2020, 2021, we heard that there had really been quite an increase in a use of the social audit model to monitor labour conditions, so up from 35% previously to 60%. We did find that only one company reported finding evidence of modern slavery in its supply chain. Now, of course, there could be a real hesitance of companies to disclose public data on modern slavery, but given the known prevalence of forced labour and human trafficking in the sector, this is really indicative that audit reports and auditors are either missing forced labour altogether or failing to equate indicators of forced labour to modern slavery risk. So what are the limitations? Well, the first thing really is to acknowledge that great diversity in social audit methodologies. And in when I invited you, and thanks very much for responding to present words on social audits, and we had about benchmarks, frameworks, these which altogether sort of give a sense of this great variety on what forms the basis of the audit process. So there's differences in terms of the issues, the percentage of workers interviewed, whether interviews take place on site and off site, and whether audits are announced or unannounced. But there are some common elements we find that underpin a really ultimately flawed model for detecting labour abuse. So just in the interest of time, I will just go through a few of the bullet points presented on the slides, and some of these issues again came up in our conversation via the chat. So the first is that social audits and certifications, by their nature, are this top-down compliance-focused approach. And by this I mean that the focus of the exercise is really, we have the checkboard, or a man with a checkboard in the chat, is really to check off issues as being complied with or not, as the case may be. And also these issues assessed during the audit process aren't those issues identified by workers as being the most important or present based on their own workers' own lived experience of working conditions. Audit frameworks often defer to national law, which may provide weaker protections than international standards. This is particularly a concern with respect to freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, which are, as we know, not protected in many legal systems, and are key and crucial enabling rights to claim other human rights. And as we know, national law may also give lower protections to certain categories of workers, including migrant workers and workers engaged through recruitment agencies. Audit reports are often, though not always, confidential, making it very difficult for workers and their representatives to verify findings, to challenge inaccuracies, and overall to validate the process. And finally, social audits focus on abuse at the level of production site, factories, farms, fishing levels, rather than drivers of abuse. So just for the interest of time, I think say that the main shortcoming of social audits from the perspective of workers and other rights holders is that the model has by and large failed to prevent abuses in global supply chain. And this alone, this reality alone should really lead companies to pivot to other methodologies that really embed that bedrock principle of human rights due diligence, ongoing and meaningful stakeholder engagement. I'm sure many of you are well aware of the core elements of human rights due diligence under the UN Guiding Principles. As you all know, this is really a requirement on companies to know about their human rights impacts, take action, and then to show and communicate what they're doing to address them. So what is effective due diligence? Well, I mentioned that social auditing and associated certifications are essentially that compliance, top-down compliance focused approach, a way to police suppliers in many cases. So you'll see advice and statements that companies should be requiring suppliers to demonstrate compliance with these specified social and human rights standards. This really is pushing that responsibility to respect down the supply chain. Conversely, human rights due diligence is that rights holder focused process based on a shared responsibility to respect human rights. To be effective, due diligence processes must be holistic and proactive and really take into account that changing nature of human rights situations. Crucially, I mentioned there must be meaningful engagement with stakeholders at all stages of the process. So in the context of assessing labour conditions, workers are of course best placed to identify salient human rights issues, as well as what needs to be done to address these. So workers must really be front and centre of the process. Effective engagement also includes engaging with other stakeholders, trade unions, worker-led groups, and NGOs. And at the same time, engagement needs to be safe. Workers must be able to speak freely, speak out without fear of, or in actuality, facing repercussion. We've heard from the reports during social audit processes that workers are afraid to speak out for fear of job loss. And then importantly, human rights due diligence is not only this downstream process, but also companies taking, assessing the impact of their own actions, decisions, their business model, and purchasing practices. Now, quickly look at access to remedy, just for interest of time and to allow plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Although access to remedy is not one of the core elements of human rights due diligence, processes for remediation really must be built into that system. And here too, that principle of safe and meaningful stakeholder consultation applies. I mentioned that social audit reports and the corrective action plans, if they are produced, are often confidential. And if they do recommend remedial steps, which sometimes they don't, this process doesn't ensure that those who are directly affected, workers and other rights holders, are able to validate that process, be able to say whether the steps are sufficient and whether they've really addressed the problem. And again, this reflects that top-down approach rather than one that's predicated on meaningful consultation. So I'm going to close with this slide, which is a still from a resource developed by Know the Chain, a partner organisation which helps companies identify and report on forced labour risks in their supply chains. Now, this is from their 2020 ICT benchmark, but the principles ring true across different sectors. An alternative approach to social audits, companies should be using rights holder-centred approaches such as worker-driven monitoring. I think Lisa will delve into what this looks like in practice more, but as a top line, this really means genuinely independent monitoring, involving workers throughout the process. That's from designing monitoring activities and associated complaint mechanisms to really assessing the effectiveness of remedial activities. And this, of course, needs to be coupled with root cause analysis, looking at those drivers of abuse, companies taking action to prevent them, including reforming the business model. But I'll stop here. And say thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and questions, and we'll now pass to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chara. That was wonderful. Dr. Lisa Rende Taylor, come on down.
Dr. Taylor, you're on mute. We're unable to hear.
Okay, am I on?
Thank you.
It's really early here, everybody. Thank you very much for your understanding. Yeah, so good morning. Thank you so much to Conservation Alliance for inviting me to be on an amazing panel with Chara. I'm hoping that our presentations will be quite complementary, and where she sort of left off with alternative approaches to social audits, I'm going to pick up. My name is Lisa, I'm from Issara Institute, and essentially, I think what we do will kind of come out through the course of the presentation, but we work on the ground. We are a labor nonprofit that works on the ground. So my task today is for us to explore, can environmental and labor NGOs get on the same page regarding how labor conditions should be monitored? And we're going to start with a couple of questions. Maybe we can use the chat box as well here, or we can have a little bit more chat later, actually. But I wanted to kind of kick you off with a few images here. On the left, you see one of our team members who is sitting and chatting with a number of fishers that we sort of have relationships with different fisher communities, checking in, how are things going, sharing updates on what's changing with regard to Thai law in this case. These are Burmese foreign migrant workers who are working in the fishing industry in Thailand. On the right, you see our team working within a seafood processing factory, an export-oriented factory that is doing something very similar. We go in there, check in with the workers, share our worker voice channels, which I will talk with you about in the coming slides to make sure everyone is up to date on what are your rights and responsibilities or whatever under the law, your contracts, and what are your employers and recruiters' responsibilities to you, and where can you go and who can you call if you need some assistance or have some questions. So this is basically what worker voice monitoring, which we're going to talk about, looks like kind of as you sort of implement it in the field. The thought questions I'd like to kind of throw out to you right in here are, who could best speak to the realities of labor conditions faced by these seafood workers? And so this is kind of raised as an initial sort of contrast to social audits, where I think that for a lot of folks in the labor community, certainly those of us at Issara Institute, we feel like social audits, as many of you mentioned in the chat box, essentially have auditors speaking to the labor conditions, primarily driven by information from the employers. They're working with the employers, the factory owners, and so on, who are providing a large amount of the data that they're using to inform their audit with different kind of varying and sometimes questionable ethically practices and how they may talk to workers. Certainly, we find that it's not really safeguarded. So who could best speak to the realities of labor conditions? Who knows best what these men and women are facing? I think from a labor perspective, we would say the workers could speak best to the realities of what they're facing. And so this is what drives a lot of the conversations these days which is, what are the ways that we can connect responsible businesses and even governments to the realities of what's happening with labor and recruitment conditions as coming from workers? Like, it should be verified by workers. Number two, do you think workers like these might face a risk of reprisals for telling the truth about their recruitment and labor conditions? What would it take to protect them? This is a question from observing on the ground that is not at all adequately addressed by the audit compliance mechanisms. And then number three, what are the implications to these people if an audit says they're okay, but they're not? And this too is something that we face all the time. And Chara did a really great sort of roundup to talking about the issues that are kind of arising. Sometimes, NGOs are picking up on it. Sometimes journalists are picking up on it. Sometimes, unfortunately, nobody is picking up on it. But these issues, including forced labor and human trafficking, are happening in audited workplaces. They really are. And so this conversation is really, it's high time to have it, or perhaps you could even say it's overdue. So in my preparing for this, in talking with Mariah and Laura, I wanted to kind of take a little bit of time to try to see how close we are between environmental and labor NGOs in getting to some common ground. Which of these statements are easy to agree on and which are contentious? So, I'm just going to kind of run right through these. And if anything, it would be really great if you all sort of reflect on it. And if anyone can share anything in the chat box, I'm going to see if I can possibly, if I pick up the chat box, I don't know if you guys can see it if I'm presenting. I kind of hope not. So first statement, workers are the people who could best speak to actual working conditions. Is this something that we all can kind of agree on? I hope so. Credible safeguards are legitimately needed for many seafood workers and not just the day or week of a site visit. I think, from looking at the feedback that was coming into Chara's initial query, I think that a lot of us are on the same page in understanding that, someone coming in with the clipboard and asking sensitive questions of workers, you walk away and there's not a lot within the sort of structure of the audit kind of framework or relationships that even allows for safeguarding, long-term safeguarding. Because it's not like once the auditor walks out the door, of course, that the workers there, whoever spoke to the auditors, are safe and they feel like, everything is kind of safeguarded. Whether or not exactly what they say goes to their employers or their line supervisors, they can still face retaliation and reprisal. So this is an important point. Number three, trust in the data collector, safeguards, and the wider process is needed to get accurate, valid data on working conditions. And for a lot of good reasons, auditors are not trusted by workers. And this is something that, again, Chara touched on in her presentation. It's not just, for example, if you're running a seafood cert and you come in and do an audit and you do one of the better audits out there, it's not just about you, it's about the fact that these people in workplaces are undergoing audits all the time. And what is the way that auditors are engaging with the employers? How are they getting the information? How are they engaging with the workers, or are they not engaging with the workers? And there's a climate and a culture of, pre-audit coaching, preparation, threats, and these kinds of things about how to respond when the auditors are coming. And so it just essentially affects the entire exercise or the approach. It's better to aspire to find and remediate labor issues as they arise versus only if and when an audit takes place. And I'm going to talk about this in some of my following slides. But I think that if you work on the ground and if you work with workers and you hear from workers all the time, what you realize is that there's a whole suite of a very dynamic, situation within factories or other workplaces where things change, issues come and go, particularly issues by, bad line supervisors, sexual harassment by particular people, just basically poor monitoring and oversight and responsibility taken by employers, where if you come in and do an audit, and if an audit even is able to catch anything, maybe that issue might be pushed to be remediated, but what about everything else? And so this is a very sort of significant thing that you see when you work on the ground with workers. Next point, we're going to talk a little bit more in my next slides about what is ongoing real-time monitoring data. Essentially, we would sort of assert that it is generally superior to data from single point in time measurements, which is sort of what audits are. They are a scan, a point in time. Social audits run the risk of certifying or ticking the box of businesses that actually have entrenched labor abuses. Again, this came up in Chara's presentation. An audit or assert giving the site a pass, even if there's entrenched labor abuses that an audit did not uncover, it could reasonably be seen as doing harm from an ethics standpoint. So this is where we're starting to get a little bit more to, us as labor people trying to see what does it look like as we sort of are meeting with other, stakeholder groups. Do we agree on this? The other previous points are a little bit sort of maybe easy to agree on, but do we all agree with and understand or have thought enough about the fact that ticking a box and giving a factory a pass, even if there might be entrenched labor issues, some of us do see that as doing harm from an ethics standpoint. And that's something that is, again, important to understand if we're going to figure out how we sort of meet in the middle. And then finally, environmental audits and certifications can coexist with worker-driven social responsibility, but environmental NGOs should run the former and labor NGOs should run the latter. Is this something that is easy for us to agree on? Or is this something that we need to talk about a little bit more? Before we answer that, maybe we should go on and I can show you a little bit more about what worker voice-driven monitoring and supply chains can look like. I can figure out how to advance my slides. Because what I'm wondering, and again, in talking, with Mariah and Laura and thinking a little bit about it, talking with some of you all too, I'm wondering if you sort of reflect on the history. Oh, sorry. Yeah. There we go. Can you hear me now? All right. I think one of the things I'm sort of, one of our hypotheses is that perhaps it would be easier for the labor and environmental NGOs to come together if there was a greater awareness of exactly what labor solutions exist right now in 2021. And so I'm going to introduce you a bit to what we call inclusive labor monitoring. This is what Issara Institute is running in Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Okay, oh good, so we have a comment. NGOs can also do harm by taking on roles that properly belong to workers' organizations and undermining their efforts to organize trade unions. I'm really glad you raised that. Actually, when I first started getting involved in this space about 20 years ago, one of the first things that I did when I was at the State Department was run a pretty big grant to Solidarity Center when it was being run by Phil Robertson at the time, who is a very dear and important kind of pillar of the labor rights movement and all the kind of benefits that he's helped to bring to the worker communities. So that was 20 years ago. And since then, it has been really important to push for freedom of association and collective bargaining, the foreign migrant workers being able to have the right to not just join, but form and run trade unions to be able to represent themselves. However, what has happened in those past 20 years? Essentially, those past 20 years, a primary focus has been pushing for that. But what we find, I think, is that you could say that the push from those kinds of programs to be able to have those things be legal has not really been counterbalanced, or it's been sort of counterbalanced by sort of just trade regimes and different kinds of mechanisms that basically no one is really standing strong. Nobody is taking a strong stance. I can say very much, I know Thailand, nobody is saying, hey, Thailand, if you don't do these things, we're going to start, bringing sanctions or making it a lot more difficult for you to kind of participate and trade with our country. And so when you are on the ground and it's 20 years later, and you have workers who are suffering from all of these different issues, you have a question you have to sort of pose to yourself. Do I continue to try to push for that? Or do I realize that millions of dollars are going towards that? And in the meantime, someone has to fill the gap of actually helping these millions of workers right now. And if you talk with these workers, and actually we work very closely, for example, with CTUM, who is the trade union for Myanmar, we work very close collaboration. We run grants to them. We collaborate on cases that are both in Myanmar and Thailand, for example, and actually also in Malaysia. And the trade unions themselves say, it is important for you all to be there and for us to work together, because there are a number of workers right now who are not in a union. They never joined a union. They cannot be in a union. We cannot help them. And so someone has to be able to help those people. And so on the ground, if you actually come on the ground, you actually see close collaboration between trade unions and NGOs. And we can touch on that a little bit more later too, but let's get back to inclusive labor monitoring. So on the left, you see the same pictures that I showed you before of our staff. They're interacting with workers. They're saying, hey, give us a call if you have any questions. We can try to answer them. If you need any help, we can try to help you, or kind of help you help yourselves, or refer you to someone who can kind of give you a bit more assistance. What that turns into is what you see on the right, which is a graph essentially of the calls that are coming in and different messages and so on over time. And so essentially the number on the left is like the numbers per month. So you can see as you sort of go through per month that we're getting 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, sometimes more calls and messages per month from workers. This volume is higher than the US National Anti-Trafficking Hotline and UK National Anti-Trafficking Hotlines combined. There is a need in an environment where workers are calling in for a range of different issues, but a lot of them, of course, are labor issues. And I sort of want to point out that this is what ongoing monitoring looks like. That this is what the data looks like. It looks like large amounts of data that are coming in over time, and I'll show you how it's coded and how it's sort of communicated to different stakeholders. And just to kind of have in mind when you're thinking about other kinds of data, that's a lot of the point of this presentation, is thinking about what does this data look like versus social audit data? What is the position of workers when running this kind of system versus social audits? And so, for example, point-in-time data collection from an audit, I mean, you can imagine it would look very different from this. And even sort of like panel interviewing over time, these are things that we would like to see happening in places where you can't run systems like this. But essentially, it's good to kind of keep in mind what are things that are within the realm of possibility now, especially in places like Southeast Asia, where we can clearly see, a lot of workers do have phones. Does every worker have a phone? Of course not, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands do, and they use them, and they call, and they ask questions, and they do ask for advice. What happens when these calls come in? So I'm going to show you a little bit about what the data looks like in greater detail. So on the left, this is aggregate data from a brand or retailer's supply chain. And so, we have brands and retailers that sign on to be partners with us. And so a brand or retailer may have, 40 or 80 or 100 suppliers within, this is for our data for Thailand. And so when they give us their supply chain information, we're essentially hearing from workers in those workplaces and other workplaces all the time. Whenever the calls come in, they're essentially coded according to what the issues are that are being reported and kind of followed up on and so on. We put them into 5 buckets. You can see them in the pie chart to the left. Working conditions, employer-employee communications and relations, labor recruitment, payment systems and transparency, and living and eating conditions. There's a lot of ways that sort of these different issues need to be actioned. A lot of times, I mean, it's really like all the workers are in these unique situations. They, a lot of times there's a lot that they can do themselves, but they don't know. So for example, if they have issues that they've taken to their HR has been really kind of poor about it. There's a lot of things that they can do if they understand how to approach the government, because the government, of course, is supposed to do, proper things to be able to ensure that the rights of workers are upheld, that they're paid their, proper salaries over time. There's different kinds of excessive deductions and so on that we see happen all the time. And so sometimes it is about working with the government. Sometimes it is also about working with the brands and retailers who are signed on to, have them understand what is happening in my supply chain, what is happening with my suppliers, and what do I need to do as a duty bearer under the Regu principles to be able to ensure that my suppliers are operating properly and that we are incentivizing good behavior and we are disincentivizing bad behavior. And so just taking this kind of purple slice from the left. I'm just going to look at working conditions to show you what it looks like when you sort of break it down a little bit. So this is within a supply chain, and we actually have 77 different categorizations of labor violations. And the examples of the way that these break down, there's some examples on the left. So issues with overtime being involuntary or forced or illegal, unsafe or hazardous working conditions, discrimination by gender, nationality, ethnicity of the workplace, and so on, as you can kind of read on down. And then what the colored bars represent, we don't have the names of suppliers, but they represent specific suppliers. I had to remove those for the presentation, obviously. And so, for example, you can see that the sort of pink fuchsia supplier is kind of represented in almost every sort of labor violation listed here. And there's many more. I just had to kind of take a snippet and have it be large enough that you could read it. And then you can also see things like issues with overtime being involuntary, forced, or illegal is an issue for multiple suppliers for this brand of retailer, which should make them realize I need to really sort of figure out what I need to do better, because this is a very serious issue. These are violations of law. This is going to be taken to the government, and I need to kind of help my supplier really kind of kick into gear and do the right thing for remediation. If you look at the second one from the bottom, you see one block, the pink block, pregnancy, dismissal, or hazardous conditions for pregnant worker. And you can essentially kind of, the brand or retailer can get a sense of like, oh, okay, so this isn't an issue that we see in a lot of factories. That's good, but it's good to understand that for this particular supplier, they have a range of issues, including this one, which is less common in the industry as represented in my supply chain, but it's a thing, and I'm glad I know about it. And again, I kind of want to highlight that these are issues that are coming up in audited factories. And a lot of them have like worker relations committees and things like that are often mostly kind of managed by the employers, or sort of there's a control element there. Deep dive on one supplier. So another thing that we want to do to drive better kind of remediation on the part of suppliers, recruiters, and the brands and retailers who are connected to these supply chains is ensure that everyone kind of has access to information that tracks what's happening over time. So essentially what you see here is for a single supplier, across the top are gauges that sort of tracks how they're doing in terms of assessments of their quality of responses to issues, their timeliness of response, and their openness to reform. And one of the things that we're trying to sort of really kind of hit home with brands and retailers is we want you to have this information about all the suppliers in your supply chain so that you can start making a little bit better decisions and comparing between them, not just about, you know, cost, volume, and different sort of, you know, demands that you have for production procurement, but about other things too. Like we want them to start getting this range of data that they can start assessing and comparing their suppliers amongst each others and thinking about incentivizing, again, the better suppliers, the better responding suppliers, and disincentivizing the worst responding suppliers. So what you see on the bottom are some of the different KPIs. Again, this is the snapshot for what I could fit on the screen of a single supplier, and it has a list of, I selected here working conditions, you can see in the green bar, and it has a range of different violations that have come and go in that workplace over the time period that's across the x-axis. And what I really sort of want to highlight here is if there was a social audit, what would an audit have detected if it came in January 2021? What would it have picked up if it came in the beginning of March or June or July? The answer is, I mean, well, we don't know if it would pick up on any of these things at all. It depends on the quality of the audit, but these things change. And so when we think about the issue of remediation and systems change, in order to really get to the root causes, which again, Chara talked about really well, to get to the root causes, to be more preventive so that there are less chances for people to be harmed in the future, because you address these root causes, you have to be able to understand the totality of what's happening in a factory. And if you do, or any kind of workplace, and so if you do a social audit, maybe you'll catch, you know, the issue with workforce or workloads, maybe, you know, the buyer will kind of push for remediation of that, but what about everything else? What about the people who are, you know, suffering from the situations of all these other things that are happening on an ongoing basis? This is the argument for monitoring versus just these kind of point-in-time measures. And then finally, I just kind of wanted to show you a quick snapshot of when you like what kind of data, what level of detail can you actually get to brands and retailers about how their suppliers are responding. I think especially when you're talking about countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, Thailand, what we try to sort of kind of emphasize with brands and retailers is, it's not about like, if you find an issue, it's bad, and so just cut it to cut your risk. Like, obviously, I think most of us realize that's sort of a pretty terrible response, because you've been benefiting from these workers being exploited the whole time in the products that you buy. But essentially to kind of look at some of these countries as these are countries where this risk is happening everywhere. It is most likely in your supply chain. So to identify it is a good thing, because you can help to sort of drive some remediation and maybe do some deeper dives to understand more of what's going on. What are the root causes that are driving these issues? But also to say, well, if you have an issue and a supplier responds really well, that's pretty good. It shows that you can raise an issue, workers can raise issues, the employer can listen to the workers, do their investigation, do a sort of a properly kind of framed investigation, understanding anonymity, confidentiality. The workers say that they're really pleased at the end. These kinds of things to really sort of build up the sort of the communication and respect between employers and employees. These are the things that if you see issues, but it's resolved in a way that the employers, but I mean, especially it's the employees that say, okay, I feel pretty good about this. I feel like the employer actually legitimately heard me. I feel like the employer wanted to know what was going on with us. These are the kinds of things that, again, kind of going back to the earlier question, when you work in an environment where we all have sort of tried and been unable to get collective bargaining and freedom of association for decades for foreign migrant workers, it is worthwhile, or some of us would argue, and certainly a lot of workers that we work with would argue, it is worthwhile to try to build that up as much as possible for groups of workers within factories, within industries, and within countries to the best of their ability, building them up to understand what are their rights under the law, what are the policies, how do they assess their situation according to the laws as well as their contracts, and what can they all do together to figure out how to resolve these better outcomes. When HR responds to them, what do they do next? And yes, sometimes they do need a bit of assistance from NGOs on the ground. And yes, the responses of brands and retailers can sometimes be really, really helpful in helping the supplier to realize, oh, okay, it's not business as usual. I need to change the way I think about these things and start responding to it in a different way. So that kind of brings us to our discussion questions. As Conservation Alliance, they sort of asked Chara and I to sort of think about some questions to kick things off. This is a little bit of a snapshot just of, what worker voice and what inclusive labor monitoring sort of looks like if you sort of step back from 30,000 feet. This was actually from last year. But essentially, I think our concluding thought is it's better, and of course, like I think a lot of you are nonprofits, NGOs, academic research institutions, and so on. And we are a nonprofit as well. And so the argument is, so it's better to collaborate, expand, join forces to innovate rather than duplicate or replicate. And it's definitely not good to work at cross purposes. This is sort of a kind of a pretty central tenet, I think, for most nonprofits, I would hope. Given this, how can we take a strengths-based approach to collaboration to improve the sustainability of seafood, and what can CAS do? So Laura, Mariah, how is that for kicking off the conversation for you guys to facilitate?
Hi, thanks, Lisa. Great presentation. And that's perfect. So we'll just open up the floor now for folks to respond to these prompts that Lisa's got up on the screen here. You can utilize the chat box, or you can also, I think, just to come off mute and we'll chat.
I'm not quite sure if it's okay just to jump in with questions or comments.
Go for it.
Yeah, great, thanks. So hello, everyone. My name is Blake Stock from Fairtrade USA. Thank you to both the presenters for an excellent overview of kind of the space and a lot of the work that's going on. Obviously, Fairtrade USA is a social and environmental NGO that relies on social audits to address and analyze worker conditions in the supply chains that we operate in, including in the seafood space. And I think that the critiques that have been raised in this presentation are absolutely fair and things that we have identified internally and continually try to improve upon, while simultaneously embedding mechanisms within our system that try to alleviate the pressures of exclusively relying on social audits and social auditors. For example, social engagement teams that can operate as a mechanism to engage with leadership in a way that is similar to union representation without being called as such. One question I have for the presenters is, do you see this as an either or scenario? Like this is either social auditing or this kind of broader transformational approach to worker-centric protections that, from my perspective, would require significant stakeholder engagement across the entire sector, including at the governmental level. And to bring about that sort of transformational change is a long road with a valid and admirable end goal, but it seems like it is going to take incredible efforts by lots of actors throughout supply chains and civil society to bring about. So what role can social auditing play during that transition to this more comprehensive approach?
To both of us. Yeah, I have to come in. Thanks. Sorry. It's that tech. I've been stumped again by sun and tech. That's a really great question. And as we're here to have this, open, frank conversation, I feel comfortable sharing. It's a question we're having internally as well. And I think the way we there are organizations that are looking, to make social audit, that model, more like that ground up, the ground truthing approach. For us, we see them as distinct, fundamentally, conceptually different processes that worker monitoring, that sort of is that basis of human rights due diligence, on the other hand, social audits. And so is it either or in the sense of you do one or the other? I mean, my expectation, at least you'll know far more from direct engagement, is that some companies are doing a little bit of both. These supply chains are huge, complex, covering so many different issues. The likelihood that there'll be in some, level of some suppliers, there'll be that in-depth worker monitoring processes, worker voice as a process and approach. And then in other aspects, there'll be a reliance on certifications and social audits. I'm not sure if that answers that question, but I think the reality is that there should be a movement far more towards that bottom-up approach. But I'll pass to Lisa because my assumption is they're both. But it's a good question. It's one we're having as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks for the great question. I think from our working with businesses and we kind of started off really as human rights people, and then we sort of really started peeping under the sheets of business and seeing how they respond to these issues. And what I'm sort of gathering is that, that there is this question of like, this sort of like, nonprofit supported worker driven response, is it really scalable? It would take a lot of work. But let's kind of reflect on what social audits are. They've been around since the 1950s. It's like a $43 billion industry. And yet, is it globally scalable? Is it at scale? It's totally not at scale. It's globally available, but it's not at scale because it's cost prohibitive. The businesses are not paying to, it's just that they're auditing like a fraction, a pretty small fraction of their entire extended supply chains across all the different products and sectors that we work in, for sure. And there's an extensive documentation on this as well. And so when we talk about there's a lot of work to do, I think that, when we work with businesses, And if we were to kind of talk with some of our more progressive businesses and be like, okay, so would you rather, kind of pay X thousand dollars per audit, find an issue, and then you kind of maybe remediate it, but you miss some, and then there's more issues that come up, and then you have to go in, and every time you go in, you're paying, some consultancy like $12,000 or whatever to go do a deep dive assessment and so on. That is totally not scalable. Do they want that? And so there's also an issue of, it's not just about, the human rights question of, should workers be the ones to validate working conditions? These very basic questions that I think we feel very strongly like, absolutely, but it's also a question of what's the demand for. I don't see a demand from, especially the more progressive businesses, for just more and better audits, because they don't want to pay for it and they're not going to pay for it. And I think that the more that we have legislation that gets more and more kind of tough and specific, like, so for me, I'm based in the United States, like the Tariff Act has completely got the attention of brands and retailers, and that's what you want, right? They're worried that issues are going to be found. They should have been worried a long time ago, but so now it's got their attention because there are financial ramifications, and they're realizing that these, risks exist across their supply chain. So what are they going to do? So now in business is just like, what are we going to do? Just going to keep on paying for like audits whenever, these issues get found and escalated. So it's not just about, nonprofits and worker organizations trying to push for something different. I think we have to have a reality check of what the state is of the world and what a lot of different stakeholders would really benefit from.
Thanks both for your responses there. Thanks, Blake, for your good question. We've only got a few minutes left. I'm wondering if we might be able to address a few questions. There's some folks wondering about the cost of the inclusive labor monitoring program. So in maybe like 60 seconds or less, if we could speak to that.
Okay, so 60 seconds or less is kind of like a business transaction. Like, I want you to be my, assigned to MSA, and I'm going to kind of sign on your services. And I think one of our points is that's not like a nice way to go for nonprofits, but essentially as a nonprofit system, and this is something that is expanding, and we're trying to expand it to be a system that other nonprofits can use as well, in other parts of the world. Like, we don't want to expand, but essentially the idea is we're a nonprofit. We got development funds to be able to build a system. We want the system to be a public good. We want as many workers and worker organizations to be able to benefit from using it. And actually that does in some countries include trade unions, because they need tools as they come to us to really kind of organize and log all the things that are coming in a way that business is sort of used to going into the system and saying, okay, I understand how they break down these labor violations. I understand how this is coded. I understand how to track, my suppliers. I understand where I need to lean in. And so I think that's sort of the answer is, it's not about trying to get these resources to continue to pay for a system or to build these systems around the world. It's about trying to support the strengthening of a network of nonprofits, worker organizations, and others that could benefit from using these tools to safely communicate and connect responsible parties with worker voice. There are some NGOs that we're talking with that are talking about how can we use this to connect this to responsible government folks. For example, foreign ministries abroad. The embassy of X in some country is responsible for helping their workers. So it's a little bit bigger than just kind of all the supply chain stuff. It is about connecting duty bearers to the reality of what workers of all kinds and all kinds of industries are experiencing. And it's about the democratization of worker voice. I mean, we work with a lot of young workers. We work with a lot of Gen Z, Burmese, and Cambodian. I mean, they want to represent their own voice, frankly speaking. Do you know what I mean? They have their own things to say. They have their own identity. And I think that these systems to really kind of encourage, these young people to engage and to speak up for themselves and to think about, how they can be a part of like changing their own life in the world is a very positive thing that we can leave behind for that generation.
That's an awesome note to maybe wrap up on. We're at time here. Lisa, Chara, thank you so much for being here. I learned a ton. We are so grateful for your time. We had, as you saw, a lot of great questions in the chat, so maybe we'll try and scheme up a way we can get responses back and keep the discussion going. A reminder, again, we're hosting another conversation around this topic of social audits, so stay tuned for more to come soon on that. And again, another plug for our Alliance annual meeting. The link is there in the chat to see more details about that, we'd love to have you there, specifically folks working in human and labor rights, so we can continue on in these important conversations. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you all again soon. Take good care.